6 weeks ago, Mary Trump, the president's niece, prevailed in a lawsuit brought against her by a member of her own family to try to stop her from releasing this new book. It's called Too Much and Never Enough: How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. In the book, which has now sold millions of copies, Mary Trump revealed herself as the main source for the New York Times' explosive Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting on the potentially illegal tax schemes the Trump family employed for decades to hide their assets and to avoid taxes. The book also made the claim that President Trump got into college by paying someone to take his SATs for him. Shortly after the book's release, Mary Trump sat for an interview here with me and shared even more news about her family that wasn't in the book. She told me that she had personally heard her uncle use anti-Semitic slurs and racist slurs, including saying specifically that she has heard him use the N-word. She said she was extremely concerned that the president would not agree to a peaceful transition of power if the upcoming election had a close result. Well, now, as her uncle accepts the Republican Party's nomination for a second term, Mary Trump is back in the news with some proof to back up some of her claims. Mary Trump has now revealed that she secretly recorded about 15 hours of conversations during 2018 and 2019 with her aunt, the president's sister, former federal judge Marianne Trump Barry.
For 1 year.
This goddamn tweet and the lying. Oh my God, I'm talking too freely, but you know, the change of stories, the lack of preparation, the lying, the holy. But he's appealing to the base, what they're doing with the kids at the border. I mean,
unfiltered Marianne Trump Barry, well, unfiltered except for our bleep, speaking to her niece about her brother, the president of the United States. Here's one more clip you should hear. Here she, how she did the president's homework while he was in college. She also says the president got into college by having somebody else take his entrance exams for him.
He went to Fordham for 1 year, and then he got into University of Pennsylvania. I guess he had somebody take the exams.
No way.
And
he had somebody take his entrance exams?
SATs or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, Jesus.
That's what I believe. I even remember the name.
Oh, man.
But then he,
I mean, not that I was shocked.
But now when you do when he does stories, he never mentions Fordham.
Of course not.
Oh, my God.
No, he went to the Wharton School, which also isn't true. He didn't go. He went to the University of Pennsylvania.
Went to University of Pennsylvania.
And took a couple of classes, I guess, at Wharton.
Oh, that's insane. But that's it.
So,
and he, I did his homework for him. I mean,
who does your homework for you when you're president? Joining us now, I am pleased to say, is Mary Trump, the author of Too Much and Never Enough: How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. Ms. Trump, it's nice to see you again. Thank you very much for joining us on what is a very, very big night.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Let me just ask about how it feels to be a member of the Trump family watching the Republican convention this week. All presidents and presidential candidates showcase their family to a certain extent at events like this. That's become traditional. But we have seen all of the president's adult children speak, some of their wives and girlfriends, the first lady giving a big address. There's been a lot of members of the family speaking. I wonder if you see any of that differently than we do.
I'm not sure. What I feel, though, is that, one, it's inappropriate, and two, maybe I know better than most people how untrue so much of what they're saying is. The idea of passing Donald off as a great family man is up there with trying to pass him off as a successful businessman. So it's disturbing to watch, honestly. The whole thing has been disturbing, but that in particular has been.
That's what you're characterizing correctly, that they have used family members of all stripes to describe him as being family focused, also as being empathetic, also as being somebody who respects and loves and elevates women. And the family has talked about him as essentially somebody they can vouch for his character over the course of his life. You obviously told an opposite portrait. You painted an opposite portrait to that in your book. For people who have seen all of these speeches over the course of the week, how would you sort of correct that impression? What would you tell them that they should understand in terms of what you've seen, contrary to what his other family members have talked about this week?
Well, most basically, I'd say look at what he does, not at what other people who are either related to him or paid by him say about him. You know, we have so much evidence that he doesn't care about other people, that he doesn't care about people in his family. And I'm not entirely sure why American citizens continue to be fooled by the rhetoric. So what I would say, in addition to that, is just take a step back. Forget about your whatever party you belong to. Forget about your preconceived notions and pay attention to what's happened to this country in the last 400 years or 4 years. I can't tell anymore. 3.5 years.
Mary, since we last spoke, Joe Biden, of course, has announced that his running mate is Kamala Harris, the first woman of color on a major party ticket in American history. Given your history with the president, and you told me in our interview about your book that you had heard him use racial slurs, you had heard him use the N-word, you'd heard him use anti-Semitic slurs. I just wonder what your feeling is, what your impression is of how the president may feel about running against a ticket that has a black woman on it. Given what you know of him and what you've seen, how we should understand that might affect him.
I think he's going to have a very hard time with it because he's going to have to walk a tightrope that he's not good at that kind of thing. Also, it's not just a woman of color. It's Kamala Harris, who knows exactly how to speak to people like Donald. I was really pleased with her speech today because she made it very clear that she's not going to pull punches and she's going to go right at the problem. And Donald's not used to that.
Hi, Mary. I'm Nicolle Wallace. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I was riveted by your conversation with Rachel and all of your interviews. I want to ask you about something that happened after your book came out, though. The Senate Intelligence Committee issued a section in their report about compromise, about the kinds of things that might embarrass Donald Trump. And while they found no evidence that he'd been blackmailed by those things, they gathered them anyway. Someone on my show, Frank Figliuzzi, who worked in counterintelligence, said the Russians may have decided it was useless to use it on Donald Trump because he may not be capable of shame. And I didn't know what to make of that, but I wonder if you think, someone who has affairs with porn stars that he writes checks to cover up from the Oval Office, are we looking at him the wrong way if we think he can feel shame?
Absolutely. He feels no shame. He has no humility. And that's part of the reason we're in the mess we're in, is because so many norms in this country have depended upon politicians' ability to feel shame and to do the right thing, even if they didn't want to, because they didn't want to deal with the consequences. So, Donald has been rewarded for bad behavior his entire life. So I think the motives are much more likely to be financial. There is absolutely no way to shame him. And that is another thing that makes the stuff we've heard about his love of his family just so absurd over the last 3 days.
I want to ask you, too, it's wonderful to have someone to pose these questions to who actually knows him. Robert Mueller, who spent 23 months investigating ties to Russia, was never able to interview him and therefore was never able to reach a conclusion about whether there was any intention to commit crimes in his mind. When he commits tax fraud or bank fraud, is there knowledge of the criminal act?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because it's very interesting how Donald's mind works. He knows the difference between right and wrong, but if it benefits him, it is de facto not wrong. So that makes it kind of tricky to pin him down.
Yeah. Hey, it's Joy Ann Reid. How are you? Thank you for being here tonight. Really appreciate you joining us. So I have a question that kind of pivots off of what Nicolle asked. We know that Cy Vance in New York now has a case going in which he is going to get access to Donald Trump's tax returns, his financial records. We know that Eric Trump is also being looked at. He's refusing to cooperate right now in an investigation. So as things are swirling closer to Donald Trump and his family's finances and to his company, give us your insider view of what he might do, because I think there's a lot of fear of what a cornered Donald Trump might do when he's really afraid that he might be about to be exposed.
Yeah, we should be afraid, honestly. I don't like saying that, but we need to be prepared, because one of the, if not the only effective way to make sure that this nightmare ends in November is to continue keeping pressure on Donald through investigations, through truth-telling, et cetera. And we need to understand that along with that comes the real danger that he's going to lash out, that he's going to use the power of his office to continue to commit atrocities, which we're seeing every day. We cannot forget that the reason hundreds, if not thousands of people are dying every day is because Donald isn't doing anything, which at this point needs to be seen as a deliberate act.
And a very quick second question to you. We're seeing this scene that is on the little screen while you're there of all of these people packed in, which what could be a COVID super spreader event at the White House.
It is remarkable, the size of that crowd and how close everybody is. I mean, I've seen one or two masks the whole time that we have been watching. There's one in the scene. But look, I mean, that doesn't look like America in 2020.
No.
Sorry.
No, of course. No, absolutely. I mean, and I totally agree. It's disturbing for us to watch it because we're covering COVID every day. Does Donald Trump actually care? Because, there is some reporting that he changed his mind about sending help to states for hurricanes when he was told, well, these are our people that could die. Do you think that he cares that some of his own people could get sick and maybe die by being at this event at the White House?
No, not at all. Because what is important to him is that people think that everything's fine. And tonight is of a piece with what I've seen of the rest of the convention. It's an attempt to elide the last 6 months from the country's memory and pretend that 2020 never happened. And basically, nobody died, the economy's great, and that lie can't be pulled off unless he has people crowding into the lawn of the People's House, by the way, which is another issue entirely, that they're all breaking the law by even doing it in the first place. And the risks that those people are taking, or the risks he's putting them at, are completely irrelevant to him, because for Donald, the only thing that matters is if he is winning in the moment.
Mary, we were just talking moments ago about what appear to be quite serious ongoing legal investigations of the president and his business. And we don't know exactly what those are, but since you and I last spoke and since your book came out, we've actually understood more of the contours of that because of public court filings. And it does seem like New York prosecutors are looking at potential bank fraud, potential insurance fraud, and other financial crimes, white-collar crimes around the business. That trove of documents about the family business that you handed over to the New York Times that produced their bombshell reporting is sort of got to be seen as the mother lode in terms of understanding a lot of at least the origins of some of these schemes for which your family business was accused. I don't know if you can answer this or not, but I'm just going to ask. Have you been asked to provide documents to any law enforcement investigation since you have outed yourself as the source of those documents to the Times?
I haven't, which I find interesting. And the only conclusion I can draw from that is they don't need my documents. They probably have plenty of others. And I think the brilliant investigative work that was done by the New York Times team in that extraordinary article probably laid the foundation for a lot of these investigations, because I think it's extraordinarily unlikely that behavior ceased in 2004.
Mary Trump, the niece of President Donald Trump, who tonight will be accepting the nomination of his party for a second term as president. Mary, I really appreciate you coming back and talking with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Mary Trump's book is called Too Much and Never Enough.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.